Welcome to Fireside Gaming. I'm Billum, and this week we're kicking off a new series called First Thoughts. In this, I'll provide my initial impressions on a game after playing it for a short period of time. The goal here is to target new game releases that I may not have the time to beat in the near future, but still have something I want to say about them. The first game we're checking out for this is Edge of Eternity, which just came out earlier this week after being in early access for about 2 years. Edge of Eternity is a turn-based RPG. As such, there's no way I was going to be able to burn through it in time for a full review this weekend, and truthfully, I wouldn't want to. I'd rather take my time to sit down and really enjoy the game rather than feel like I have to rush to get a review out. However, this is a JRPG, and I've got no intention of just spending a few minutes with it. Instead, I spent about 7 hours with the game before preparing this piece. In that time, I got a good grasp of what the game is all about, but there's clearly some things I just can't know yet. Here's what I do know. The game features turn-based combat that makes use of the active time battle system found in some Final Fantasy games. Yes, they even call it ATB. What this means is that players will have to wait for the ATB bar to fill before they can perform an action in battle. In the case of mages, they'll have to wait to get their turn, and then they'll have to wait a second time for a charge bar to fill so they can cast the spell. Players can do more than just attack and cast spells though. There's also the option of blocking, using items, and moving. Yes, moving. Each battle takes place on a grid of hexagons that the player and enemies can move between. This means that both can move out of the way of attacks if they have enough time. Moving around on the battlefield also allows players to set themselves up behind enemies. Doing so guarantees a critical strike for extra damage. You've also got all the other major JRPG battle systems to take advantage of in Edge of Eternity. That includes various elemental strengths and weaknesses, different types of magic for both damage and status effects, as well as equipment to collect. There's also a crafting system that players can make use of for making their own items, weapons, and armor. It's a bit more complex than I care for, but that's likely due to the fact I'm typically not the biggest fan of crafting systems. While still on the subject of weapons, one feature that I love is the ability to level them up in battle. As players do this, crystal slots are unlocked on a grid. These grids are unique to each weapon and allow players to equip various crystals to the weapons in the game. Doing so gets them stat buffs and can also provide them with different spells and abilities. I quite enjoy this as it offers up an extra bit of consideration for when you're ready to change weapons. After all, that new weapon won't have as many crystal slots unlocked, so it'll be more limited in abilities and stat boost. That means players might want to hold out for a bigger upgrade instead of switching weapons every time a new one shows up. Unfortunately, one thing that doesn't require much care is item management. Edge of Eternity is that type of RPG that completely heals the player's party and mana after every battle. Because of that, there's not much in the way of resource management in the game. Heck, I think I only used items once or twice outside of the tutorials, and one of those times was to revive a guest party member with no armor that went down in one shot during a boss fight. Outside of that, I just haven't had any use for items, and that's a bit of a bummer. Getting back to the positives, the environments in Edge of Eternity are absolutely beautiful. I just can't express how much I love them. There's so much detail and care given to every city, and the developer, Midgar Studio by the way, did an excellent job at making them feel lived in. The one thing I will note here is that players aren't going to be seeing the inside of any of those buildings anytime soon. In my time with the game, I didn't find a single building that I could actually enter. I'm sure this was a decision on the developer's part to keep the budget down since they aren't a AAA studio, so I can't blame them. It's just something that I thought was worth pointing out. While the scenery in Edge of Eternity is awe-inspiring, the characters are a bit lacking. It's not that they don't have good designs or anything like that, they do. Instead, it's clear that animations are a weakness for the developers behind this game. It's not game-ruining or anything like that, but it does stick out. On the flip side of that, the animations for battles are quick and snappy. They're incredibly engaging and fit perfectly in a turn-based RPG. Next up, we have to talk about the audio in Edge of Eternity. Let's start off with the high, which is the original soundtrack. It features some amazingly magnificent songs, and that comes as no surprise. Some of the tracks were composed by Yasunori Mitsuda, and it shows. For those that don't know, he's behind the music in Chrono Cross, which is easily my favorite video game soundtrack of all time. So take that bias into account here. We've also got to discuss the voice acting, which is surprisingly good from a game not put out by a major publisher. I won't say every voice in the game is great, but the vast majority of them are good, and those that aren't are at least acceptable. You've probably noticed by this point that I haven't talked about the story at all yet. That's because I intend to be very light when discussing it. There's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, I don't want to spoil anything for people that haven't played the game yet. The other reason is that I'm really not that far into it. Sure, 7 hours sounds like a lot, but we're talking about a JRPG here. These games can go long, and the developers are promising over 50 hours of playtime. At that point, I just don't think I can say much about the story yet. What I will say is that I'm enjoying it so far. For the record, I am about to discuss light spoilers for the beginning of the game. If you want to go in completely blind, I'm putting up a spoiler tag. You can simply click to the part of the video without this to avoid learning any more about the story. The game has players taking on the role of Darien, a soldier who left the army to aid his sister Celine in finding a cure for their mother's disease. This disease is called the corrosion, and it comes from a spacefaring race that brought war to the planet. So far, I've only had Darien and Celine as permanent fixtures in my party. The two play well together with a nice bit of banter between them. At the same time, they don't know everything about each other. See, Celine was sent off to become a priestess about 8 years ago, and Darien joined the military 4 years after that. So they haven't really seen each other for almost a decade now. However, they did keep in contact through letters. This creates an interesting dynamic between them where they know each other well enough to have inside jokes from growing up together. But they're also somewhat strangers that are continually learning more about each other during their travels. All in all, Edge of Eternity is a turn-based RPG that reminds me of yesteryear. The combat is basically classic Final Fantasy meets Grandia, which is a huge plus for me. The visuals, while stunning, also give off this rough feeling like a PS3 or 360 era JRPG, but it's not a deal breaker. The story also seems promising so far, and I can't wait to get deeper into it. I plan to follow up these first thought videos with final thought ones down the line, but I have to warn that I don't know when that will happen. I actually made a mistake planning the games I'm playing for the retrospective, and now I've got a handful of JRPGs on my plate at the same time. So until I can get through these, expect to see some shorter retro games in the coming weeks. I can already tell you that I plan to revisit the Mega Man X series, but without jumping directly into X4, so you'll just have to wait and see what I have planned for that. But that's enough with the channel update. Feel free to comment below, thumbs up, and subscribe if you're interested in what I'm doing here. You can also chat me up on Twitter at billum256 if that's more your style. With all that said and done, thank you for watching, and take it easy.